Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member, where you can get your own exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Harry Richards. Harry is the Deputy Director of the University of Portsmouth's Military Education Team at RAF College, Cranwell. He hosts the podcast Air Power and International Security and is the author of British Spy Fever in the First World War, Fearing the Enemy Within. Today, Harry will reveal the impact of spy fever on British society and home defence during the First World War. There will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audience. For our online audience, you can post questions in the chat bar, and these will be put to our speaker at the end of the talk. Moving on with some technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectifying them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of the browser. Usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all being said, I'm now going to hand over to Harry and hope you all enjoy today's talk. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to you all for turning up. I teach at RAF College Cranwell, so usually when I'm talking to a room full of people, they're obligated to come and hear me speak, so thank you for showing some interest in my work and turning up or logging on. So today I'm going to talk to you broadly about spy fever. Computer's already playing up, sorry. There we go. There we go. Spy fever was a period of intense fear and anxiety that took place shortly before the First World War and then after the declaration of war in 1914. And this is what my research has focused on for the past 10 years or so. But today I'm going to talk to you more specifically about what took place in August 1914, primarily because that's where the military and the army feature most prominently in the story, and also because there are some important lessons here about how soldiers, particularly inexperienced soldiers, deal with the chaos and confusion of war, and how poor leadership and vague direction can lead to panic and in some cases accidents, even fatalities. Ultimately, I want to describe or evaluate how spy fever developed in 1914. And historians have typically viewed spy fever or spy fears as a spontaneous, as an organic reaction among the general population, and that people across Britain all developed fears of spies pretty much simultaneously. In this talk, I hope to show that it was actually through the actions of local authorities that the spy peril became a very real and immediate danger in the minds of many. There was, in August 1914, a very visible hunt for German spies in various communities across Britain. And this, I argue, is what helped create and help shape wider fears of German spies across British society. Before we get into that, though, let's look at the reality of German espionage shortly before the First World War and into the First World War in Britain. The origins of German intelligence operations in Britain date back to the 1890s. During this period, the German Empire was obviously starting to build up its naval capacity and capability, and in so doing, it also reorganized its military structure. As part of this process, the German Navy created a new organization known as the Admiralstab. And by 1900, the Admiralstab had established an intelligence organization called the Nachrichtenabteilung. Fortunately for my poor German pronunciation, it's commonly referred to simply as N, which is much easier for me to say. For obvious reasons, German naval planners saw Britain as their main rival at sea. Any naval or maritime theatre that the German Navy might operate in was going to be dominated by the Royal Navy. And so N was tasked with gathering intelligence about Britain. At first, N's plans were remarkably simple. German officials hoped to recruit agents among people living within the various German communities scattered across Britain. These agents would look out for and monitor naval activity, the movements of ships, most commonly, and send coded telegrams back to the German naval attaché in London. In practice, though, this plan proved rather ill thought out. Most Germans living in Britain, ironically, didn't want to be spies. They largely moved to Britain to escape the obligations of life in Imperial Germany, most notably compulsory military service. So they weren't that keen to sign up to a military or naval intelligence apparatus. And others had built pretty comfortable lives in Britain, so weren't willing to jeopardize that or risk betraying their host country. But the obvious problem with all this was that it was centered on the naval attaché. Such a system could never provide useful intelligence in wartime because the naval attaché would, of course, be expelled as soon as war was declared. But German military and naval officers were pretty loath to get involved in espionage work because they considered it a pretty dishonest pursuit. And again, they didn't want to risk their diplomatic status. So very few attachés wanted to be involved in this system. Everything changed after the Agadir crisis in 1911, though. Collecting intelligence from within Britain became far more urgent for the German Navy. Responsibility for this effort fell to a man named Gustav Steinhauer, who styled himself later on as the Kaiser's master spy. Steinhauer tried to create a system of intelligence using intermediaries, or Mittelsmänner, and these Mittelsmänner could relay messages between Germany and agents along the British coastline. The idea was to hide the connections, because if you have agents in Plymouth or Portsmouth repeatedly sending correspondence to Potsdam, their local postmaster might get a bit suspicious, whereas if they're sending it to London and then it's forwarded on to Berlin, it could hide their nefarious activities. But the system itself, although slightly more complex than what came before it, was never particularly effective. Many of the recruits that Steinhauer did manage to recruit were pretty unreliable. Most of them were either adventurers looking for a bit of excitement or literal criminals who were after a fairly lucrative career. And these were hardly the foundations of a professional intelligence service. In any case, they were soon apprehended by the Home Section of the Secret Service Bureau, renamed MO5G in 1914 and later MI5 in 1916. And this unit was led by Captain Vernon Kell. In 1911, Kell's unit intercepted a letter trying to recruit a German living in Britain as an agent. This letter came from Potsdam and was written or sent by somebody using the name F. Reimers. F. Reimers turned out to be none other than the Steinhauer himself, and so Kell was then able to monitor the correspondence from Reimers and uncover the network of intermediaries and agents operating in Britain. Instead of arresting them, though, Kell quietly put their names on a list to be rounded up and arrested in the event of war. Still, this network never really posed any considerable threat, and it was certainly unlike the hyperbole and sensationalism of xenophobic journalism and popular spy novelists. Most of the agents that had been recruited were incredibly amateurish, and some even bordered on the absurd. One of those was a German agent named Max Schulz. Schulz had been recently released from a German prison for fraud, and N quickly recruited him and sent him to Plymouth. He arrived there in 1911. He rented a houseboat, threw very lavish and loud parties, and amused himself by firing his shotgun off the side of his boat. So not exactly an inconspicuous individual. His attempts to recruit spies were pretty poor as well. His approach was to write them a written contract, if you like, telling them what their duties and responsibilities and the useful information that they should seek to gather, and he even signed the letter. The prospective recruit simply then took the letter straight to the local police, and the evidence was pretty damning. He was arrested shortly after. Another agent, Heinrich Gross, was sent to Portsmouth. His cover was to pose as a language teacher, but he spent more time pursuing his students rather than actually gathering intelligence. When he did eventually try to recruit a naval pensioner, he asked rather blunt questions about dockyard activities, and the patriotic pensioner went straight to the dockyard police, who then arrested him shortly afterwards. So not exactly an effective intelligence apparatus. And as I said, the operatives that did exist had all pretty much been identified by Kell's unit nonetheless. But in truth, and although MI5 like to emphasize this as their foundation myth, something that was incredible success for them, the network that they did uncover was pretty small, very disorganized, and largely ineffective. And in any case, the N had effectively decided to abandon this peacetime strategy in July 1914 anyway, in favour of a different approach. This different approach used what was known as tension travellers, and these tension travellers would arrive in Britain, reconnoitre the British coastline for a few weeks at a time, and go back to Germany with the intelligence that they had gathered. Their telegrams sent to Britain through neutral countries were disguised as commercial messages, and although they were pretty simple, pretty primitive, they did largely escape the censorship. In all, N dispatched around 120 of these tension travellers to Britain during the war. Some of them carried out multiple missions during the conflict, but not a single one of them was detected. But again, the reports that they did provide were not that good. They weren't a great source of intelligence. Many of these tension travellers reported first-hand witnessing Russian troops arrive in Scotland to bolster the Allies' position on the Western Front. Whilst this was a very prevalent rumour at the time, it was obviously complete fabrication. In short then, the spies that were active in Britain before the First World War and during it were nothing like the allegations that were appearing in the press in around 1909 and were to reappear in 1914. So the question becomes, why did so many people react to the outbreak of war with fears of secret agents lurking in their midst and intent on destroying Britain from within? Now, there were, of course, many reasons why a person might fear German spies or might express these fears, but when you look at the reaction to the outbreak of war in the pages of the national and local press and trawl through the archives of the War Office, Home Office, and various county constabularies, it becomes abundantly clear that this response was anything but spontaneous. One of the very first reports to appear in the press after Britain went to war was the dramatic news in London that 21 German spies had been arrested. And this seemed to suggest or confirm many people's fears that German spies were everywhere. And exactly the same moment, newspapers were also publishing lots of details about German spies being apprehended across Europe, but particularly in Belgium. It was said that 2,000 spies had already been caught in Belgium, and that 100 of them had been executed. Spies were caught wearing Belgian military uniforms to disguise themselves, were heavily armed with explosives to cause all sorts of nuisance, and driving motor cars on secret missions. One journalist summed up the situation dramatically, claiming that Belgium had been betrayed by every stranger within their gates. And so for British readers, the implication was fairly clear. If Belgium had been crawling with German spies before the invasion, surely the same thing must be happening in Britain. The popular magazine John Bull, not known for equivocation, urged people to keep their eyes and ears wide open. And if they were to see anything suspicious, they were to report it immediately to the police or military authorities. But even more moderate newspapers gave similar advice, urging on the side of caution. One paper reassured readers that while many reports of spies might be false, might be misunderstandings, citizens still had a duty to remain vigilant. At the same time as these newspaper reports were appearing in the press, many local authorities across Britain were echoing a very similar message, most notably the local constabularies. They began taking the threat of espionage very seriously. In Elginshire, for example, the chief constable there ordered officers to watch all foreigners much more closely. and local residents were encouraged to report on the movements or suspicions of various foreigners or strangers. Particularly if they were wandering around at night, they were to be stopped and questioned, even by civilians. In Norfolk, officials there warned that spies might be using carrier pigeons to convey messages to Germany, and their solution was wonderfully simple. They just suggested that anybody with a gun start shooting pigeons flying towards the sea. There were also fears that spies might set fire to the most valuable commodity of all in East Anglia, their haystacks. And as a result, farmers were armed and organised into nightly patrols to guard their fields. In parts of southern England, the response was even more dramatic. Some police chiefs there organised civilian defence groups and instructed them to guard bridges, power stations, telegraph lines, and waterworks. Volunteers were again instructed to report suspicious foreigners and, if necessary, detain them. One particularly enthusiastic chief constable even admitted that several of the measures that he was implementing were technically illegal, but argued instead that every action against an enemy of our sovereign is legal by common law. Another police chief took matters into his own hands entirely. When he realised that the railway line carrying troops from Aldershot to Dover had been left pretty much unguarded, he quickly assembled a group of civilians, armed them with whatever weapons they could find, and posted them along the line. He later admitted that he had no official sanctioned authority to do this, but decided that it was better to act quick and answer questions later. So what we see then in August 1914 is the public, civilians, effectively being mobilised against an enemy within. But crucially, this wasn't necessarily the case across Britain. Other police forces, and these tended to be in landlocked counties, took a less serious approach, less enthusiastic approach, perhaps because they were sceptical of the threat or simply indifferent. In Leicestershire, for instance, the Chief Constable received orders from the War Office to take the threat seriously and similar measures to the ones I've just described, but he seemed unconvinced that spies posed a considerable threat. Instead of launching patrols we see in the south of England, he instructed his officers to remain focused on ordinary policing and not repeat the rumours circulating in the press, to keep alarm and panic at a minimum. Derbyshire showed similar restraint, and police correspondence from the period suggests officers were much more concerned with routine police work. And so was the case in South Wales. The local police records that survive barely mention spies at all. Instead, they are focused on everyday problems like theft, missing persons, stray dogs, assaults, and the occasional escapee from the local mental asylum. In other words, life carried on in a surprisingly normal way. The press also reflected this mixed reaction. The Bucks Herald and Bedfordshire Times, for example, reassured readers that spy mania had already begun to fade and warned against adopting heavy-handed measures. And many other newspapers across Britain, either because of their political persuasion, geographic context, or both, conveyed a similar tone. So while some communities across Britain embraced the idea that spies were everywhere, others remained sceptical or immune to spy fears. For historians looking back at this period, the reports and warnings that I've just described have been interpreted as evidence of a popular spy fever. But when we take a closer look at what was actually happening in the early weeks of the war, particularly the reports of spies being apprehended in communities across Britain, the picture becomes much more complicated. In fact, the evidence seems to suggest that the British public may not have been the driving force behind spy fever, and instead it was the local authorities themselves, police officers, soldiers, and officials responsible for defending the country who were the most suspicious and most likely to act on those suspicions. One of the main reasons why historians have assumed that the public was the driving force behind spy fever comes from a famous statement made by the then Home Secretary Reginald McKenna in September 1914. He told the House of Commons that the Metropolitan Police had received 9,000 reports of suspicious activity in the first few weeks of the war. And this number has been repeated by historians for the past 100 years as evidence of the British public becoming wildly suspicious of spies, because 9,000 reports in 4 or 5 weeks is a considerable number of suspicions. There's one problem with this figure, though. There's absolutely no evidence, or I've certainly found no evidence to support it. So where did this figure of the 9,000 reports of spies come from? And the answer seems to lie in a meeting held at the Home Office in late August 1914. At that meeting, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Edward Henry, warned officials that thousands of German and Austrian reservists remained in British cities and posed a considerable threat. The Home Office decided to take this threat seriously and began detaining large numbers of what were known as enemy aliens under recently initiated wartime powers through the Aliens Restriction Order. And so in a subsequent meeting, McKenna was informed that 680 enemy aliens had been detained in Liverpool, 220 in Hull, 140 in Cardiff, 70 in Leeds, 800 in Birmingham, 3,000 in Manchester, and 4,500 in London. Crucially, when we add these numbers together, we get just over 9,400 people. So when McKenna told Parliament that 9,000 spies had been reported, I think he's actually referring to this number, the number of enemy aliens detained through official investigations rather than popular suspicions. And so I would argue that this figure actually reveals very little about the scale of public paranoia in 1914. So, how can we measure, if at all, the extent of suspicion in Britain during the first few weeks of the war? I've argued that one of the best ways to do this is actually through using newspapers, partly because police records are so fragmentary and scarce where they do exist. Newspapers, on the other hand, provide a fairly rich source of incidents that were considered newsworthy at the time. And so during my research, I conducted a close examination of 44 different newspapers from across the British Isles and found 297 articles that featured spy scares. In other words, incidents in which an individual or individuals were suspected of being secret agents, rather than abstract fears of spies in various regions of the UK. Within these reports were 145 separate incidents involving 193 individuals accused of being spies. Now, of course, many more incidents may have actually occurred that didn't get featured in print, but this evidence would suggest the number of actual suspicions or reports of secret agent activity were in the hundreds rather than in the thousands. Now, one of the most revealing discoveries of this research was where spy scares were occurring. It showed that the majority of them happened in one single location, the British coastline. Aside from a cluster in London, most occurred pretty close to the coast. Around 2/3 of them took place in coastal regions. Clearly then, spy fears were not necessarily a universal national experience. Instead, they were shaped by local contexts. If you were exposed to the threat of a German invasion or raid, for example, you may have been more likely to fear enemy agents that might facilitate that attack, for example. Another interesting pattern is when these spy scares occurred. The majority of reports appearing in August appeared in the first 2 weeks of the conflict. And this is important because it is very much an immediate reaction to the outbreak of war, during a period of intense anxiety and unease about what might happen. Now, this is important because it suggests that the number of suspicions weren't necessarily tied to the newspaper reporting, because as the propaganda intensified, one would expect the number of accusations to also intensify. But this doesn't do that. And so at first glance, it may seem that spy fears were themselves actually spontaneous. However, when we look at the sources of suspicion, when they can be identified, quite the opposite seems to have been true. Of the 193 individuals accused of espionage, 14 of those were arrested following Kell's investigations that I mentioned previously, and so were clearly not the result of popular suspicions. of the 111 incidents in which I can identify the source of concern, only about 10% came from concerned civilians. And even if we assume that all of the incidents where I can't identify the source of concern came from concerned members of the public, less than a third of all reports appearing in print were coming from civilians. Police officers and territorial soldiers were thus much more likely to be involved in spy scares. And so this means that the public were not simply hearing about spies or reading about spies in the press, they were witnessing a very visible search for a hidden enemy in their local communities. And this was carried out not by concerned members of the public, but by the authorities themselves, or at least on the initiative of the authorities themselves. So the group most closely associated with spy scares in my research has been members of the Territorial Force, Britain's part-time volunteer army. These soldiers had been mobilised very quickly as soon as war was declared, and they were left guarding key strategic locations, most notably the railway lines across Britain. But many of these individuals were, of course, inexperienced soldiers. Before the war, in public discourse, the effectiveness of the Territorial Force had been much scrutinised, and training opportunities were incredibly limited. I think around 2/3 of the force failed to complete the annual camp each year. So these were largely untrained and unprepared soldiers. Their equipment, where it did exist, was largely outdated, and they weren't necessarily given the right stuff, and communication between the units was fairly lacking. Moreover, and this is perhaps the most crucial part to my story, the units were operating in areas that they were unfamiliar with. They were moved around the country. And this meant that soldiers were operating in unfamiliar terrain and surrounded by what were effectively strangers, because they may not have encountered the local dialects or accents or local cultures in which they were surrounded by. And so under these conditions, anxiety could easily turn into panic. And sometimes it did. One local mayor described the Territorials in his local town as the trigger-happy Territorials after he himself was fired upon for walking around a local reservoir. Another man walking along a beach near Birkenhead was blindfolded and taken to a nearby fort at gunpoint simply for carrying binoculars. In Margate, a sentry on night duty heard a noise, challenged the source of this noise 3 times, and with no response he opened fire. The unfortunate victim in this instance was a donkey. And the National Army Museum had a good picture of a donkey from the period, so I thought I'd use it. But some of these incidents did have very serious consequences indeed. In Dunfermline, soldiers shot at a telegraph linesman working above a post office because they thought he was tampering with communications. And motorcyclists were frequently shot at for failing to comply with the sentry's challenge, presumably because they couldn't hear it. But even soldiers themselves became victims of all this chaos. At a wireless station in Waltham, troops chased 2 men they believed to be suspicious, and somehow one of them ended up bayoneting the other during the pursuit. Another soldier fired at what he thought was a spy near an aircraft hangar in Surrey, only to receive returning fire, hitting him in the arm. He was later to lose that arm. 2 soldiers were even killed during 2 separate spy scares. During both instances, the alarm was raised and various search parties went off in different directions. They heard noises coming from an undisclosed location, started firing at the noise. Of course, they were just simply firing at the other search party, and unfortunately in both instances, two soldiers were killed. So when we look closely at these events, a clear pattern emerges. Spy scares were not simply the result of spontaneous public panic. Instead, I argue that they were shaped by a combination of official warnings, military preparations, and very visible security measures. And this combination made the threat feel very real, even if the evidence for actual espionage was incredibly limited. In other words, the idea of an enemy within was not just discovered, it was, to some extent, constructed. And this raises another important question. Why were so many local authorities across Britain so ready to see spies where there were none? Because after all, these reactions could have themselves been spontaneous. But in the years leading up to 1914, British officials responsible for home defence and local security had been repeatedly warned of the threat of German spies. These warnings came through official government reports, military lectures, intelligence briefings, and official memoranda. So when war finally did arrive, it was not surprising that many of these authorities were ready to face this type of threat. These fears didn't come out of nowhere. They had in fact been cultivated over the last decade. During this time then, British defence planners spent a great deal of time thinking about and preparing for the threat of invasion. The most important organisation responsible for strategy and defence planning was of course the Committee of Imperial Defence. In April 1914, i.e. only a few months before the war began, the committee once again reviewed a major report examining possible attacks on the British Isles. And this report suggested two likely scenarios. The first being a major full-scale invasion designed to defeat Britain with a major bolt-from-the-blue attack. The other was perhaps more realistic, and this was a small-scale, limited raid that was designed to disrupt mobilization rather than conquest. The second option was considered much more likely because it was thought that a smaller raiding party might be able to evade the Royal Navy far easier than a full-scale invasion, for example. Crucially, though, this report suggested that if this limited raid were to take place, it wouldn't necessarily be carried out by uniformed soldiers, it would be executed by agents already living in Britain. And this concern reflected many years of thinking about and planning for hidden enemy agents, because this idea had been firmly embedded in British defence planning. Arguably, it goes back to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. One officer who studied Prussia's rapid advance through France was Major Charles Booth Brackenbury. He believed that one of the key factors in Prussia's success was its sophisticated intelligence system that had been collecting information in France for many years previously. According to Brackenbury, the Prussian General Staff maintained a similar intelligence capability in other European countries. And so, if war in the future was to be fought at such rapid speed, Brackenbury advocated the use of a similar intelligence capability and crucially preventing other foreign potential adversaries from gathering intelligence on Britain. And Brackenbury's views carried weight because his brother, General Sir Henry Brackenbury, was later to become head of the intelligence branch at the War Office, and he shared many of his brother's concerns. And so over time we see this belief spread within the War Office and British Army that foreign powers, particularly Germany, were actively collecting information about British defences. And by the early 20th century, the War Office had begun to take this possibility very seriously. One of the men responsible was Lieutenant Colonel James Edmonds, who who headed the section within the War Office responsible for Secret Service operations. Like Brackenbury, Edmonds shared the belief that Prussia's success in 1870 was largely down to its intelligence system, and he frequently gave lectures to military officers on the importance of vigilance and watching for enemy spies in Britain, and anybody who seemed unusually interested in military installations should be treated with suspicion, according to Edmonds. And this was the warnings and advice he was giving to junior officers. So by the early 1910s, the War Office was issuing increasingly detailed instructions about how spies might operate if war were to break out. In October 1912, for example, officials circulated a memorandum describing the likely activities of German spies or foreign spies. According to this document, spies would specifically seek to obtain information regarding the construction of warships and forts, aircraft and communication systems, mobilization plans, troop deployments, naval movements. You get the gist. These are obviously important pieces of information for a foreign adversary seeking to undermine British mobilization or British cohesion. These were obviously valuable pieces of intelligence. and makes sense to be featured in this list. But the memorandum also contained what I would say interesting details, slightly alarming details, because they echoed popular tropes within popular fiction. It's very hard to identify who might be a German spy, right? There's very few differences between somebody who looks German and somebody who looks British, depending on how they're dressed, I suppose. But this memorandum reported that spies might disguise themselves as hairdressers or waiters or publicans or governesses, particularly in port and garrison towns. The War Book of 1914 then further reiterated the very same message. So while these memoranda made the threat of German spies very real, especially to the military, Vernon Kell did a lot of work in trying to spread these concerns well beyond the War Office. Because Kell's unit was still pretty small, and like today, they had no arresting powers. So he had to have the support of the police, the county constabularies, in monitoring potentially dangerous individuals, but also in arresting them. And so before the war, Kell was effectively travelling around the UK trying to warn chief constables of the spy threat. He organised conferences, issued memoranda, and encouraged police forces to watch all foreigners in their district pretty strictly. Police were urged to look out for signs of espionage and potential sabotage operations. And so by the time war broke out, these local police forces, just like the army, had received years of warnings about possible covert activity from within. And yet, there remained plenty of room for ambiguity and confusion, and herein lies the problem and perhaps the reason why there was so much panic and confusion following the declaration of war. Because besides vague accusations about how spies might disguise themselves, there was very little direction in how these individuals would identify the threat, how they would uncover who was and who wasn't a spy, or what constituted suspicious behaviour besides loitering near military installations. But of course, with everything going on, people in general wanted to understand what was going on, so they did take greater notice in military activities in their locales. And so, without these details about the scale of the threat, or how to identify the threat, these questions were very much left to the discretion of individual police forces or local military officers. In other words, then, a very serious national security threat was placed in the hands of local officials who had very little experience, if any, in dealing with this type of threat. And so when the international crisis escalated in late July 1914, the British government moved pretty quickly. On 29th of July, the authorities declared what was known as the precautionary period, a stage of heightened readiness before any formal declaration of war. During this period, the Home Office again reissued urgent instructions to police forces to take any measures they thought necessary in curtailing the threat of foreign agents. They were encouraged to bolster their ranks and recruit civilians to conduct this work and guard local infrastructure. But without clear threat assessments, i.e. how many spies were likely active in Britain, these individuals were very much left on the rumours and hearsay in local press in terms of how big the threat actually was, how many spies were in Britain, that sort of thing. And in such circumstances then, it's quite easy to understand how suspicion could then escalate. So, in conclusion then, the emotions associated with spy fever, I would argue, were not socially driven or spontaneous. They were, in fact, the result of official concerns, quite legitimate concerns, but then manifested through the actions of inexperienced and unequipped troops who weren't necessarily given the right guidance in terms of how to deal with this threat. I would argue that the fact that various warnings in the press and conveyed by local authorities existed at the start of the conflict suggests that these feelings, these emotions, were themselves not spontaneous. They were responding to explicit calls for vigilance. even if individuals weren't necessarily fearful of German spies, the way in which people responded in the press to the outbreak of war very much redefined the notion of patriotism. Suspicion and vigilance became part of that civic duty. And so if they didn't necessarily feel fearful of German spies, there was still an incentive to express or perform those emotions to show that they were in support of the war effort and doing their bit. And alongside these rumours, there were, of course, the very prominent searches, spy hunts for secret agents. And together, I think these very much refute the notion that they were organic responses to the war. And I think this very much has broader implications for how we understand spy fever, because historians have tended to assume that a gullible British public simply mistook fact for fiction, i.e. they read the novels of Le Queux, William Le Queux, one of the most popular spy novelists at the time, and thought that his fictional stories had become reality. Yet I would argue that this analysis presents an alternative explanation. Because if people did, in fact, feel fears and anxieties, they were doing so to perform, showcase their patriotism and conform to the idea of what was required of them during the First World War. But others may have just simply been excited by the spy threat, because sentry duty on the home front wasn't necessarily the most exciting endeavour ever. It was largely mundane, and they could experience large periods of boredom, for example. Yet, going on a spy hunt with your mates seems quite an attractive proposition to individuals in this situation. It provided a bit of excitement, but it also confirmed that what they were doing was relevant, was necessary, was important to the war effort because of this existential threat from within. So spy catching, I would argue, provided a clear remedy to the boredom on the home front. And many soldiers indeed wrote about their anticipation for catching a spy and their excitement found during a spy hunt. People were incredibly proud of themselves for catching a spy, for example. And of course it was justified, given all the warnings that the War Office had produced. And so while spy fever is often described as a period of fear and anxiety, I think it's worth noting that fear doesn't just terrorize, it can also excite and titillate. And so there are potentially different reactions to spy fever. And that's kind of what I've written a book about. So a bit of shameless self-promotion. It's very expensive, so I'd perhaps wait for the paperback to come out. But the book is about the different reactions, the varied emotions that could be felt in response to the spy threat. There's a chapter on the excitement and enjoyment found through spy hunting. So that's me finished. So thank you very much.